She stood in the most beautiful room in the city, crystal chandeliers pouring light like liquid gold over politicians, criminals, and celebrities who all laughed at the right moments and said nothing real. 12 years. She had given this man 12 years of her life, her art, her silence. And tonight, surrounded by his empire, his guards, his power, she felt it clearly for the first time. Not sadness, not longing, just the cold, quiet certainty that she had disappeared. Not all at once. Slowly, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the woman standing in the frame of someone else's portrait. If you're watching this story, hit like, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and follow the channel so you don't miss what happens next. The night Serena Moretti understood she had become invisible, she was wearing a dress that cost more than most people earned in 3 months. It was midnight blue, structured at the shoulders, cinched at the waist, the kind of dress that made a room turn and look. She had chosen it carefully, standing in front of the mirror in her dressing room for nearly 20 minutes, smoothing the fabric with both hands, studying her own face like she was trying to remember something she had forgotten. The dress was perfect. Her hair was perfect. The diamond earrings Luca had given her on their 10th anniversary caught the light exactly the way they were designed to. She looked like a Moretti wife. That was the problem. The Moretti estate ballroom was alive in the way only old money and criminal power could make a room alive. Not loud, not chaotic, but electric with the kind of controlled energy that came from people who understood exactly how dangerous every conversation was. 300 guests moved through the space with practiced ease, champagne flutes catching the light, laughter surfacing at precisely calculated intervals. The air smelled of imported flowers and expensive cologne, and something underneath it all that Serena had stopped being able to name, a particular scent that clung to rooms where men made decisions that ended other men's lives. She stood near the grand staircase with a glass of champagne she hadn't touched. Across the room, Luca was holding court. He always held court. That was the nature of him. The gravitational pull, the way people angled their bodies toward him when he spoke, the way his silences carried more weight than most men's words. Luca Moretti at 51 was not a handsome man in the conventional sense. His jaw was too hard, his eyes too dark, the lines around his mouth carved by decades of decisions most people didn't want to know about. But he commanded space the way a storm commanded a coastline, not by asking permission, but simply by arriving. Tonight he was wearing a charcoal suit that Serena had not seen before. He had bought it without mentioning it to her. A small thing. The kind of small thing that had been accumulating for years. She watched him lean in to say something to Senator Hargrove, a man with soft hands and a career built on looking away at the right moments. And she watched the senator laugh too enthusiastically, and she watched Luca accept the laughter with no expression at all, the way a man accepts tribute he no longer finds interesting. He hadn't looked at her in 40 minutes. She had counted. It wasn't anger she felt. Anger she could have worked with. Anger required energy, required investment, required the belief that the other person was capable of being affected by your feelings. What Serena felt standing at the edge of that ballroom was something flatter and more dangerous. It was the feeling of a woman who had stopped expecting anything and had finally noticed that she had stopped. A hand touched her elbow. "You look like you're calculating an exit route." She turned. The voice belonged to Diana Voss, the wife of Luca's attorney, a sharp-faced woman in her late 40s who wore irony like a second skin and had survived 23 years inside this world by being smarter than everyone around her and pretending otherwise. "I'm just watching," Serena said. "You've been just watching for the past hour." Diana lifted her own glass and surveyed the room with the cool assessment of a woman who had long since lost her illusions about it. "He hasn't come to you once. He's working." "He's always working." Diana said it without cruelty, which made it worse. "That's not what I asked." Serena didn't answer. She brought the champagne to her lips and drank it all at once, which was not the kind of thing Moretti wives were supposed to do at public events. And she didn't care. Across the room, Luca finally looked at her, not the way a husband looks at a wife. Not with warmth or recognition or the private language that builds between two people over a decade of shared mornings and difficult nights. He looked at her the way he looked at everything in the room, quickly, assessingly, confirming that she was where she was supposed to be, that she presented the right image, that the Moretti household was in order. Then he looked away. Serena set her empty glass on the tray of a passing waiter and excused herself from Diana with a word and a smile that required no genuine feeling behind it. She had become very good at that. She moved through the ballroom with the practiced ease of a woman who had attended hundreds of these events, nodding to faces she recognized, accepting brief embraces from people whose names she sometimes forgot, navigating the currents of the room without ever stopping long enough to be pulled into a real conversation. She slipped through the tall glass doors at the far end of the ballroom and stepped onto the terrace. The night air was cold and immediate after the heated press of 300 bodies, and she stood at the stone railing and breathed it in, the city spreading out below the estate like a map of everything Luca owned and controlled and considered his. The lights went on for miles. She used to find it beautiful. She used to stand on this terrace with him in the early years, when his arm would come around her shoulders and his mouth would be close to her ear, and he would tell her things he told no one else, and she would feel the particular dizziness of being the most important person in the most dangerous man's world. That feeling had a shelf life. She just hadn't known it at the time. Serena Vale, Sham. The voice came from her left, and it came with her maiden name. Not Moretti, not Mrs. Moretti, but Vale, the name she had carried for 26 years before she traded it for a different kind of power. And the sound of it was so unexpected that she turned sharply, her hand gripping the railing. The man standing at the far end of the terrace was tall, lean in the way of someone who moved constantly rather than someone who worked at it, dressed in a dark jacket that looked like it had been packed and unpacked across a dozen time zones. He was holding a glass of something amber, and he was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. Recognition. Genuine recognition. The kind that meant he was seeing her, not the wife, not the image, not the symbol. Adrian, she said. Adrian Cole. She had not spoken his name aloud in years, though she was aware, in the distant, carefully managed way, she was aware of many things she didn't allow herself to think about directly. That he had become one of the most recognized photojournalists in the world. His work had appeared on the covers of magazines she occasionally saw in waiting rooms. She had never looked at the articles directly. She had simply registered the name and turned the page. "I didn't know you'd be here," he said, which was the honest kind of thing he had always said. No performance in it. Luca does business with a lot of people. She heard how it sounded when she said it that way. Dry. Almost clinical. It's his event. Right. Adrian moved down the terrace toward her, not quickly, giving her space to set the terms. That had always been his way. She had forgotten that about him. The careful quality of his attention, the way he never crowded a room he wasn't sure he'd been invited into. "I'm here because Marcus Hale is one of the guests. I've been documenting his foundation work for a project. He got me an invitation. Marcus Hale." She placed the name. An architect. Clean money or clean enough? "How long are you in the city?" "Another week, maybe 2. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her properly, and she felt the specific discomfort of being looked at by someone who had known her before the estate, before the role, before 12 years of careful self-erasure. "You look well," he said, and then immediately, honestly, "I'm not sure if that's true." The bluntness of it almost made her laugh. Not the performative laughter she had deployed 3 times already tonight, at things that weren't funny, but something that started lower and felt closer to real. "That's direct," she said. "I'm not very good at the alternative." He glanced through the glass doors at the ballroom, at the chandeliers, at the beautiful controlled performance of it, and then back at her. "I always remembered you as someone who said exactly what she thought. People change." "I know." He wasn't arguing with her. "I just wonder sometimes what the trade-offs cost." She should have deflected. That was the practiced response. A light redirect. A graceful pivot to something safer. The kind of conversational judo she had mastered over a decade of navigating rooms full of dangerous people and dangerous conversations. She was very good at it. It had kept her safe, and it had kept her manageable, and it had cost her something she was only beginning to add up. Instead, she said, "More than I budgeted for." Adrian looked at her. He didn't say anything immediately, which was the right response, and she appreciated it even as she recognized that she had just said something she wouldn't be able to take back. "You were painting when I knew you," he said eventually. "At Berkeley. You had that studio space above the hardware store on Telegraph. I used to watch you work sometimes. You had this way of—" He stopped, edited himself slightly. "You were completely present when you painted, like nothing outside the canvas existed. The memory was so specific and so distant that it arrived with physical sensation, the smell of turpentine and old wood floors, the light through those high, dirty windows, the feeling of her own hands moving with certainty across a surface that asked nothing of her except honesty. "I was 22, she said. "What happened to the woman who used to dream?" He asked it simply, without accusation, without the theatrical weight the question probably deserved. He asked it the way someone asked what time it is, genuinely wanting to know, no agenda attached. And Serena, standing on the terrace of the estate that Luca Moretti had built on fear and money and the willingness to do things other men couldn't stomach, found that she had no answer ready. She had always had answers ready. For 12 years she had maintained a complete arsenal of ready answers for every difficult question, every probing journalist, every well-meaning friend who looked at her life and asked gentle versions of the thing Adrian had just asked directly. She had answers that were polished and convincing and left the questioner feeling that they had simply misunderstood the situation. She had nothing for this. The glass doors behind her opened, and a member of Luca's household staff, a young man named Paolo, who had been with the family for 3 years and who always looked faintly apologetic in her presence, leaned out and said, "Mrs. Moretti, Mr. Moretti is asking for you." Of course he was. Not because he wanted her specifically, because she was expected to be visible at his side during the dinner portion of the evening, because her presence at these events served a function, because she was part of the composition of the night, and she had stepped out of frame. "I have to go," she said to Adrian. "I know." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a card, plain, just a name and a number, and held it out to her. "In case you want to talk about painting or whatever." She took it. She didn't know why. She told herself it meant nothing, that it was the polite thing to do, that she was simply being gracious. She folded the card once and pressed it into her small clutch, and followed Paolo back through the glass doors into the light and noise and controlled performance of the ballroom, and she found Luca at the head of the long dining table where he was settling into his chair with the easy authority of a man who has never had to ask for anything twice. He glanced up when she arrived. "There you are," he said. "Not where were you? Not I was looking for you. There you are." A statement of inventory. She had been a missing item, and now the inventory was complete. "Here I am," she said, and sat down, and smiled at the man to her left whose name she couldn't remember, and picked up her fork. The card in her clutch seemed to weigh more than it should have. She got through dinner in the practiced way she got through most things. Surface engagement, careful navigation, the performance of a woman who was exactly where she chose to be. She answered questions about the estate renovations she had overseen the previous spring. She deflected questions about children with the practiced grace of someone who had deflected them approximately 800 times. She listened to 3 men argue about real estate development in the waterfront district and contributed 2 observations that made her sound informed and took nothing from her genuinely. Luca, seated at the head of the table, was magnificent in the way he always was at these events. Command without effort. The room organized itself around his comfort. She had watched him do it for 12 years and she still recognized the skill in it, even as she recognized that she had stopped being moved by it. After dessert was cleared, after the last guests had filtered out, after the household staff had begun the quiet, systematic process of returning the estate to order, Serena went upstairs. She did not wait for Luca. That had been a habit once. Waiting up, finding small reasons to keep herself available to the rhythms of his evenings, measuring her own rest against the unpredictability of his schedule. She had stopped doing it somewhere around year 8. He had not appeared to notice. She washed the makeup from her face with methodical attention, and in the mirror above the bathroom sink she looked at herself without the softening effect of lighting designed to flatter. 41 years old, not young in the way she had been at 22 in that studio above the hardware store, when she had been unself-conscious about her own face in a way she would not fully appreciate until much later. There were lines now. A tiredness behind the eyes that sleep didn't entirely resolve. She pressed her palms flat against the cool marble of the sink. What happened to the woman who used to dream? She lay in bed in the dark and listened to the sounds of the estate settling around her. The distant voices of the last staff members departing, the occasional murmur of Luca's security detail moving through the grounds, the particular quality of silence that came from being inside a building that was designed to be impenetrable. And she thought about that question for a long time. She thought about the answer. She thought about the way she had not had one. When Luca came to bed sometime after 2 in the morning, she was still awake, though she kept her breathing even and her eyes closed. She felt him settle onto his side of the enormous bed. The distance between them exactly what it had been for years, precise and unspoken. And within minutes she heard the slow change in his breathing that meant he had gone to sleep. Like a man with nothing pressing on his mind, she stared at the ceiling. At some point in the night she got up quietly, went to the closet and found her clutch from the evening. She took out the card. In the dim light from the window she read the name, Adrian Cole, just that, and a phone number. And then she stood there in the dark holding it. She put it in the drawer of her nightstand. She went back to bed. She did not sleep until almost dawn, and when she did sleep she dreamed about paint, about a canvas that was completely blank, and the particular anticipatory feeling of standing in front of it with a brush already loaded with color, the moment just before the first mark, when everything was still possible and nothing had been committed to yet. She woke up with the image still in her hands. Luca was already gone. She lay in the empty bed and listened to the estate operating around her. The hum of the kitchen staff beginning breakfast preparations, the sound of vehicles on the drive below, and something moved in her chest that was not quite pain and not quite hope, but occupied the same general territory as both. She got up. She dressed. She ate breakfast alone at the long table in the morning room, looking out at the grounds where 2 of Luca's security men were doing their morning sweep, and she drank her coffee and thought about a room on the East Wing's 3rd floor that had not been used in 4 years. It had been a sitting room once. Then it had been briefly discussed as a library. Then it had simply been left, furniture covered in white sheets, windows shuttered, one of those spaces that accumulates in large houses when people stop having the time or energy to decide what they want from their rooms. It had good north light. She had noticed that about it years ago and filed it away without doing anything about the noticing. She carried her coffee up to the 3rd floor. The room smelled of dust and disuse. She pulled the sheet off the furniture, a sofa, 2 chairs, a writing desk that nobody wrote at, and opened the shutters, and the north light came in exactly the way she had remembered, steady, diffuse, the kind of light that didn't flatter or dramatize, that showed things as they were. She stood in the middle of the room for a long time. Then she took out her phone and opened a browser and typed, "Art supplies delivery, same day." She stood in the north light of the empty room and scrolled through the results and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, a sensation that she eventually identified as wanting something, specifically, concretely, for herself. It was such a small thing, it felt enormous. She placed the order. While she waited, she went to find Paolo and told him she wanted the room on the 3rd floor cleared and cleaned. She wanted the walls wiped down. She wanted a drop cloth on the floor. He looked at her with the carefully neutral expression of a man who had learned that his job required him to execute requests without commentary, and he said he would have it done by afternoon. "One more thing," she said. "Yes, Mrs. Moretti?" "Don't mention it to Mr. Moretti." She met his eyes steadily. "It's a personal project. He has enough on his mind." Paolo held her gaze for exactly the right amount of time, and then nodded once. "Of course." She went back downstairs and moved through the morning with a different quality of attention. She was still the woman who managed the household with quiet efficiency, who handled the correspondence and the social calendar and the endless low-level logistics of running a residence the size of a small hotel. She was still all of those things, but underneath it, something was running that had been stopped for a long time. An engine, small and newly started, burning rough, not yet certain of itself, but running. The supplies arrived at 2 in the afternoon. She carried them upstairs herself, the canvas, the stretchers, the paints, the brushes in their paper wrapping, and she set them in the clean, empty room while the afternoon light was still good. And she stood among them and breathed in the smell of linseed oil and fresh canvas, and something in her throat tightened in a way she hadn't anticipated. She didn't paint that day. She just stood in the room with the supplies around her and let herself want to. That night, Luca came home at 7, earlier than usual, which meant something had gone smoothly that he had expected to go badly. She could read his moods from 30 feet by the way he moved through a doorway. Tonight he moved like a man who had won something, loose in the shoulders, the particular ease that came from a problem resolved. He kissed her on the temple when he found her in the library. Passing kiss. The kind that meant hello without asking anything. "Good day," she said. "Productive." He poured himself a drink. Castellano finally moved, signed off on the waterfront contracts. He said it like she would know what it meant, which she did. Castellano was a city official who had been resistant for months, and the waterfront development was a project Luca had been engineering for 2 years. She had never asked how the resistance had been overcome. She had learned early which questions not to ask. You? Fine, she said. Quiet. He nodded, satisfied, and settled into the chair across from her with his drink and his phone, and the evening proceeded in the way their evenings had proceeded for years. Parallel, adjacent, two people occupying the same space with minimal intersection. She thought about the room on the third floor. She thought about the blank canvas leaning against the wall up there in the dark. She thought about Adrian's question, which had taken root somewhere inside her and was not going to stop growing just because she didn't water it. What happened to the woman who used to dream? She looked at Luca, at his face bent over his phone, the hard jaw, the dark eyes moving across the screen, the total absorption of a man whose world existed entirely in the realm of strategy and power and consequence. And she felt something she recognized only because she had felt it once before, a long time ago. At 26, standing in a different room in a different life, on the last night before she had said yes to the question that had changed everything. She felt the specific weight of a decision gathering, not formed yet, not decided, but present, real. A shape in the dark that she could not pretend wasn't there. She excused herself early and went upstairs and lay in the dark, and the decision sat on her chest like a stone, and she let it sit there, and she breathed around it, and she did not sleep for a long time. In the nightstand drawer, Adrian Cole's card was still there. She had not moved it, she had not thrown it away. In the morning, before Luca was awake, before the household staff arrived, before the estate machinery spun back up to its daily operational speed, Serena went to the third-floor room and she stood in front of the blank canvas in the gray pre-dawn light, and she picked up a brush. Her hand was shaking slightly. She noticed it. She let it shake. She put the brush to the canvas, and 12 years of silence came pouring out of her in the only language that had ever told the truth. She painted until the light changed and the sounds of the house beginning its day reached her through the closed door. And when she finally set the brush down and stepped back to look at what she had made, she stood very still for a long time. It was rough. It was unsteady. The technique had gaps in it. 12 years of disuse had taken a real toll, and she could see every place where her hand had hesitated or her judgment had failed. But it was hers. Completely, undeniably hers. She covered it with a cloth and washed the paint from her hands at the small utility sink Paolo had installed against the far wall, and she looked at her paint-stained fingers under the running water and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the uncertainty and the thing that was still gathering and still unformed, something that might have been the beginning of herself. 3 floors below, she heard Luca's alarm go off. She dried her hands. She went downstairs. The first painting took her 11 days to finish. Not 11 days of continuous work. 11 days of stolen hours, early mornings before the estate woke up, occasional afternoons when Luca was in meetings that ran long and the household settled into its midday quiet. She learned quickly which floorboards on the third floor creaked and which ones didn't. She learned to clean her brushes thoroughly before coming downstairs so the smell of turpentine didn't follow her. She learned to keep a change of shirt folded in the back of the supply cabinet Paolo had installed against the east wall, because paint had a way of finding skin and fabric without asking permission. Paolo knew. He had to know. He managed the room's cleaning. He had seen the supplies. He occasionally brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked, setting it just inside the door without comment. But Paolo was a man who understood that some things in the Moretti household ran more smoothly when they were not discussed, and he had worked for the family long enough to develop very good instincts about which category any given piece of information fell into. Serena didn't ask him to keep her secret. She had told him once not to mention it to Luca. That was enough. The first painting was of hands. She hadn't planned it that way. She had stood in front of the blank canvas on that first morning with no clear intention, just the loaded brush and the shaking that she had decided to let happen. And what came out were hands. Large hands. A man's hands, she supposed, though she wasn't entirely sure. Heavy at the knuckles, spread flat across a surface that might have been a table, or might have been a chest, or might have been something else entirely, pressing down with a weight that was not quite violence, but was not far from it either. The color palette had gone dark almost immediately. Deep charcoals, bruised purples, a gray that sat at the edge of blue. She stood back from it on the 11th day and looked at it for a long time. She knew whose hands they were, She didn't write it down anywhere. The second canvas she started the same morning. Something had shifted in her body during those 11 days. A recalibration, subtle but real, the way a joint that has been held in one position for too long slowly remembers its full range of motion. She stood straighter. She woke before her alarm with something waiting for her instead of the flat gray weight of another managed day. She ate breakfast with more attention to the food itself, which was a small thing but felt connected to a larger thing she couldn't name precisely yet. Luca noticed none of it, or if he noticed, he filed it in the category of information that didn't require his active attention. His world had expanded in the weeks following the Castellano deal. New meetings, new pressures, a series of late nights that kept him from the house until well past midnight. She heard him sometimes when he came in, the low voices of his security detail in the drive, the particular sound of the front door closing with the specific care of a man trying not to wake a household. She was already awake. She didn't call out to him. On a Thursday, in the third week, she went to a gallery opening in the city. It was not a Moretti event. It was not a function she attended in her capacity as anyone's wife. Diana Voss had called her. They spoke on the phone occasionally, these calls that were neither friendship nor social obligation, but something in between that had survived 12 years without requiring a label, and mentioned that a young painter named Costa Verne was showing his first major collection downtown. You used to know about this kind of thing, Diana said. I still know about it. Then come. A pause. Come as yourself, Serena, not as Mrs. Moretti. Just come. She told Luca she was having dinner with Diana, which was true enough. They did eat. At a narrow Greek place 2 blocks from the gallery, Diana drinking wine with the focused dedication of a woman who had earned her vices, Serena eating spanakopita and feeling the strange lightness of being in a restaurant that had nothing to do with anyone's power structure. The gallery was small and crowded in the good way, people standing close together with their drinks, the work on the walls demanding actual attention. Costa Verne was 28 and painted with the reckless certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of his own instincts. His colors were savage. His compositions broke rules with what felt like genuine indifference rather than performance. Serena stood in front of one piece for a long time. A figure in a red room, the walls pressing in from all 4 sides. The figure not panicked but simply present, inhabiting the compression with a kind of exhausted dignity. And she felt the back of her throat tighten. You're crying, Diana said from beside her. I'm not. You're about to. Serena pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. Breathed. It's a very good painting. It is. Diana was quiet for a moment. Are you painting again? Serena looked at her. I'm not asking to report back to anyone, Diana said. I'm asking because I'm looking at your face right now and I'm seeing something I haven't seen on it in a while. What are you seeing? Recognition. Diana turned back to the painting. Like you're looking at something you understand from the inside. Serena said nothing, but she didn't deny it. On the drive home, her own driver, Luca insisted on that, the security protocols that governed her movements when she was out without him. She sat in the back seat and watched the city move past the window and thought about the figure in the red room. The exhausted dignity of it. The way the painter had refused to make the figure desperate or dramatic had just shown her there, present, surviving. She was still thinking about it when she walked into the house and found Luca in the front hall. He was still in his suit jacket, which meant he had just arrived. He was holding his phone, and he looked up when she came through the door, and something crossed his face that she couldn't entirely read. Not anger, not exactly, but a sharpness, an alertness. Diana's, she said before he could ask. Gallery opening. She mentioned it last week. I know. He pocketed his phone. I'm not checking up on you. I didn't say you were. He looked at her for a moment. The sharpness was still there, underneath something else. You look different. I'm tired. It's late. That's not what I mean. She met his eyes. What do you mean, Luca? He held her gaze and then something shifted and he looked away, which was not something he did often, and she noted it without commenting on it. Nothing. Get some sleep. She went upstairs. In the 3rd floor room, in the dark, the second canvas was waiting. She didn't go to it that night. She went to bed and lay in the familiar dark and thought about the sharpness in Luca's face and the figure in the red room and the feeling she'd had in the gallery, that sudden destabilizing sense of being seen by a piece of work, of a stranger's painting reaching across the room and finding something in her chest and squeezing it. She thought about Adrian Cole's card in her nightstand drawer. She thought about it for a long time. She didn't take it out. 2 days later, she did. She sat on the edge of the bed in the morning light with the card in her hand for a full minute before she picked up her phone. She typed the number. She stared at the blank message field. She typed, "I went to a gallery opening last week. First time in years. I cried in front of a painting. Thought you'd find that appropriately embarrassing." She stared at it. She sent it. The response came 4 minutes later. "Not embarrassing at all. That's what paintings are for." "Which one got you?" She told him. He knew Costa Vern's work, had photographed him once, 2 years ago, for a European arts magazine. He said Vern painted like someone who had survived something he hadn't figured out yet how to talk about in words. She said, "That's exactly what it felt like to look at." He said, "Are you painting?" She looked at the message for a moment. "Yes," she typed. "Badly. But yes. Badly is where everything good starts." She put the phone down and went to the third floor and painted for 3 hours, and the second canvas, which had been hesitant and uncertain in its first stage, began to find its intention. It was a room, a large room, high ceilings, beautiful in the way that spaces built for display are beautiful. And in the center of it, very small, a woman standing alone. The woman's back was to the viewer. You couldn't see her face. You didn't need to. She and Adrian exchanged messages over the next 2 weeks. Nothing frequent. Days sometimes passed between exchanges, and nothing that crossed into territory she couldn't have read aloud to someone. They talked about painting and photography, about the mechanics of visual language, about the particular loneliness of making work that no one sees yet. He sent her a photo he had taken in Lisbon, a woman in a yellow coat standing at a window, her reflection ghosted in the glass beside her real face. She looked at that photo for a long time. She did not tell Luca about the messages. She told herself it was because it wasn't significant enough to mention. She told herself it was because Luca didn't have bandwidth for things that weren't relevant to his operations. She told herself a number of reasonable things. She knew what she was actually doing. She was keeping something for herself. After 12 years of her interior life being shaped by the demands of someone else's world, she was keeping a small thing private, and it felt, not wrong exactly, but charged. Like standing too close to an electrical source. The warmth without quite touching the current. The third canvas she started was larger, almost 4 feet across. She had to order a custom stretcher, and she had Paolo pick it up from the supply house, so there was no delivery record at the front gate. Again, she didn't ask him to handle it that way. He simply did. They had developed a language of implication that required no direct conversation. Luca was home for a stretch of 10 days in which he had cleared most of his external calendar. She didn't know why. She had stopped asking about the operational logic of his schedule years ago. And the effect was a kind of sustained domestic proximity that felt, after months of his absence, almost disorienting. He was at breakfast. He was at dinner. He moved through the house with the contained energy of a man who was not built for stillness, but was attempting it, the way a large engine sounds when it's running at low idle. She was careful during those 10 days. She went to the third floor less. She messaged Adrian not at all. She performed the rhythms of their shared life with the practiced competence she had always brought to it. The meals, the social appearances, the brief conversations that touched surfaces without breaking through them. On the 5th day, Luca came to find her in the library in the late afternoon. She was reading. Actually reading, not performing it. A biography of an abstract expressionist painter she had ordered online, which had arrived in a plain brown package that she had carried upstairs without comment. He sat down across from her. She lowered the book. "What are you reading?" he said. She showed him the cover. Something moved in his face. Not recognition exactly. He would not have known the painter's name, but something more like the registration of information. His wife was reading an art book. His wife, who had not painted since before, he wouldn't have been able to name the year, she thought. He didn't track that kind of detail. "Since when?" he said. "Since I started being interested again." She kept her voice even, not defensive, not apologetic, even. He looked at the book, then at her. "You should have said something." "I'm saying something now." "That's not what I—" He stopped. The jaw tightened. "I didn't know you were unhappy." The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "Luca." She set the book on her knee. "We don't talk about what I am or am not. That's not fair. It's accurate." The jaw worked again. He was not a man who received pushback well. Not from anyone, but especially not in his own house, where the entire architecture of daily life was organized around his comfort and operational requirements. She had watched him dismantle men in business negotiations for showing less resistance than she was showing him right now. He didn't dismantle her, he sat with it, which was, she noted it, different. I want to know what's going on with you, he said. It came out slightly wrong, slightly stiff, the way a genuine sentiment does when it hasn't been said often enough to develop fluency. You want to know, she said slowly, or you want to make sure nothing is wrong with the way things look. The silence that followed was not comfortable. That's a hell of a thing to say, he said quietly. Yes, she agreed. It is. He left the room shortly after. She heard him on his phone in the hallway, back to work, back to the operational language of his actual life. And she opened her book again and stared at the page without reading it, and felt a particular trembling aftermath of having said something true to someone who wasn't ready for it. She felt frightened. She also felt, underneath the fear, something harder and more durable. She had not apologized. She had not softened it. She had said the true thing, and she had let it sit in the room, and she had not rushed to clean it up. That was new. She went to the third floor that night after dinner, after Luca had retreated to his study, and she stood in front of the large canvas in the low light of the work lamp, and she painted for 2 hours with a fury and a precision that surprised her. The painting was coming into focus, the large room, the small figure with her back turned, but now there was something else in it, a quality of light from an unseen source, angling in from outside the frame, finding the figure and illuminating a sliver of her profile, just enough to show the jaw set and the eyes open. Not desperate, not helpless, looking. She was still cleaning her brushes when her phone buzzed. A message from Adrian. I'm doing a short series of portraits, city residents, different backgrounds. I'm looking for a final subject. Someone with a face that has a history in it. I immediately thought of you. No pressure, and I mean that literally. Just putting it out there. She read it twice. She looked at her paint-stained hands. She thought about Luca downstairs in his study, surrounded by the machinery of his power, and she thought about the conversation in the library and the word, unhappy, hanging in the air between them like something neither of them knew how to hold. She typed, when? He responded immediately. This week, if you're available? My studio. It would take about 2 hours. She stared at the message. She knew what saying yes meant. Not because it was wrong. It wasn't wrong. It was a photograph. It was an artist asking another person who was becoming an artist again to participate in a project, but because of what it would require. A lie of omission at minimum. A managed absence. A thing that existed outside the frame of her life as Luca understood it. She had kept the painting secret. She had kept the messages secret. This would be one more thing. She thought about the figure in the red room at Costa Verne's show. The exhausted dignity. The presence without performance. She typed, send me the address. She put the phone in her pocket and turned off the work lamp and stood in the dark room for a moment with the large canvas invisible in front of her. Then she went downstairs, washed her hands thoroughly at the kitchen sink, poured herself a glass of water, and carried it to bed. She lay in the dark with her eyes open. The decision was made. She could feel it the way you feel a door that has just closed behind you. Not with regret, but with the irreversible clarity of a threshold crossed. The particular silence of a moment after which everything that follows is different from everything that came before. 3 floors up, the large canvas waited in the dark. The figure in it was still turning. Not yet fully turned, but turning. And 2 days later, on a gray Tuesday morning, when Luca was in a meeting that would run until evening, Serena drove across the city to a studio address she had memorized and deleted from her phone. And she walked through a door, and she did not look back. And that was the morning Luca's head of security pulled the gate log and saw an unscheduled departure and flagged it and sent the notation upward in the way all anomalies were sent upward in the Moretti household, to the one man who had standing instructions to be informed of everything. So, Luca did not come home that Tuesday night. Serena knew something was wrong before she heard the car in the drive. She knew it the way she had learned to know things in this house. Not through information, but through atmosphere, through the particular quality of silence that settled over the estate in the late afternoon when the household staff moved differently, with a careful, eyes-down efficiency that meant something had shifted in the operational temperature above them. Paolo brought her tea at 4 o'clock without being asked, which he only did when he was concerned about something and had no other way to express it. He set it on the table beside her chair in the library and left without speaking, and she watched him go and felt the cold begin at the base of her spine. She had been back from Adrian's studio since noon. 2 hours of sitting in front of a camera in a converted warehouse space on the industrial edge of the city. Adrian working quietly, almost without direction, the camera not a weapon but a kind of patient witness, asking nothing from her except presence. She had expected to feel exposed. Instead, she had felt strangely the opposite, seen in a way that did not require her to perform the scene. They had talked while he worked, about painting, about the large canvas on the third floor, about a group exhibition he knew of, a curated show of emerging and returning artists at the Callaway Gallery, submissions opening in 6 weeks. You should submit, he said, not pushing, stating. I've been painting again for 2 months. I've seen photographs of your third canvas. She had sent him one, a detail shot of the upper left corner, the quality of light she had finally gotten right. You're not emerging, you're returning. There's a difference. The work has weight. She had driven home with the Callaway Gallery name written on a scrap of paper in her bag, and the particular buzzing aliveness of a person who has just been handed a possibility they're not sure they deserve. That feeling lasted until she walked into the house and felt the atmosphere. Now she sat in the library with her untouched tea and the light going gold and thin through the tall windows, and she waited. Luca arrived at 6:47. She heard him come through the front door, heard the brief exchange with the security detail, clipped, functional, the conversation of men who communicated in necessary minimums, heard his footsteps cross the entrance hall and come down the corridor toward the library with a pace that was not his usual pace. His usual pace was measured, deliberate, the walk of a man who owned the floor under his feet. This was faster, tighter. He opened the library door. I was still in his jacket. His tie was loosened but not removed, the knot dragged down and slightly crooked in a way that on Luca Moretti looked almost violent, like something had gotten hold of it. His face was... She searched for the word and landed on controlled. Not calm. Controlled. The way a fire is controlled when there is still a great deal of it. He came into the room and he closed the door behind him, and he did not sit down. Where were you this morning? He said. Not a question. The inflection was flat, declarative, the syntax of a man who already knew the answer and was giving her the opportunity to tell the truth before the alternative became necessary. Serena set her teacup down. Her hands were steady. She was slightly surprised by that. I told you I had errands. Errands. He said the word like he was turning it over to look at what was under it. You drove to the Crane District. You were there for 2 hours and 11 minutes. You came back alone. The Crane District. Adrian's studio was in the Crane District. The gate log. The flagged departure. She had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that the security apparatus existed and that her movements were technically trackable, but she had lived inside that awareness the way you live inside any low-level danger, by not looking at it directly. She looked at it now. I was sitting for a portrait, she said, a photographic portrait, for an art series. Something moved in Luca's face, not the fire getting bigger, something more complicated. With who? A photographer. Which photographer, Serena? She held his eyes. Adrian Cole. The silence was total. Not empty. Full. Packed with 12 years of accumulated weight that had just shifted suddenly on its foundations, and both of them could feel the movement. Luca's jaw was a hard line. His hands were at his sides and very still, which she had learned over a decade was more dangerous than visible agitation. Visible agitation meant he was processing. Stillness meant he had already processed and arrived somewhere. The man from the gala, he said. Yes. You've been in contact with him. We've exchanged messages about painting, about art. It's been a professional exchange between two people who both work in visual. Don't. His voice didn't rise. It went the opposite direction, dropping to something quiet and precise that was worse than shouting. Don't manage me right now. I'm not one of the guests at a dinner table. She stopped. He moved then, not toward her but across the room, to the window, putting distance and glass between himself and whatever he was feeling, and she watched his reflection in the darkening pane, his back to her, his hand coming up to press flat against the frame. How long? He said. Since the gala. 6 weeks, approximately. 6 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. You've been lying to me for 6 weeks. I haven't lied. He turned from the window and the look on his face stopped her. You had a room set up on the third floor. You've been going up there in the mornings. Paolo has been covering for you. Each sentence arrived separate, like items being placed on a table. Evidence. You've been texting a man I don't know about activities you chose not to mention to me. You drove across the city this morning and told me you had errands. He paused. What would you call it? She felt the heat in her face. I'd call it having a life that belongs to me. In my house. I live here too, Luca. Do you? He said it without inflection, and somehow that was the most cutting version of it. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been building a separate existence inside this one, and you've had my own staff helping you do it. I've been painting. Her voice was steady, but she could hear the edge under it, the thing that had been building for weeks and months, and if she was honest, years. I have been painting in a room in this house because I needed something that was mine, and I didn't ask your permission because I knew that you would make it about yourself, about what it looked like, about whether it was appropriate or convenient or useful to the Moretti household. And I was not going to ask permission to pick up a paintbrush in my own. It's not about the painting. He cut across her and his voice was still quiet, but the control in it was fraying at the edges. She could hear it. It's about him. Don't reframe this. There is nothing about him that requires framing. It is a professional exchange between two adults who... You went to his studio alone. You didn't tell me. You deleted his address from your phone. He waited a beat. Yes, I know that. The tech team pulled your device log this afternoon. The cold moved from her spine outward into her arms. Her phone. He had pulled her phone records, not the messages. Those were encrypted. She had been careful. Some instinct she hadn't fully acknowledged had made her careful. But the location data, the search history, the deleted contacts. She stared at him. You had my phone accessed, she said. I had an anomaly investigated. That is standard protocol in this household when what? She stood up. When your wife leaves without informing security? When she has the audacity to go somewhere unscheduled? She could hear her own voice changing, the steadiness giving way to something she had been holding below the waterline for a very long time. That's standard protocol. For your wife. For anyone in this house. The protocols exist for... I am not anyone in this house. The words came out hot and precise. I am not an asset. I am not a security variable. I am not a piece of the operation that requires monitoring, and I have been standing in this marriage for 12 years being treated like all three of those things. And I am telling you right now, Luca, I am telling you clearly that what you just did with my phone is the most explicit confirmation of everything I have felt for the last decade, and you need to understand that. He stared at her. She had not spoken to him like this before. In 12 years, she had never raised her voice to him in anger. She had been careful. She had been managed. She had taken the edges off every difficult feeling before presenting it. The practiced softening. The careful diplomacy of a woman who had understood, without anyone spelling it out, that certain registers were not safe. She had just used a register she had never used. The room held it. Luca's face was doing something she had not seen before. Not the controlled anger, not the operational sharpness, but something underneath both of those things. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like a man who has just heard something he cannot unhear and is only now beginning to understand what it means. Serena, I'm going upstairs. We're not done. I am. She picked up her book from the chair. Her hands were shaking now. The steadiness had lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and now it was gone, and she was angry and frightened and something else, something that felt almost like relief, the specific relief of a wound that has finally been opened after too long. I am done for tonight, Luca. Whatever else you need to say to me, it can wait until I'm not standing in a room where you've just told me you had my private device accessed because I took an unscheduled drive. She walked past him to the door. He didn't stop her physically. She had not thought he would. That was not the architecture of his control. Not with her. Not in 12 years. His control over her had always been more structural than direct, built into the design of the life rather than imposed moment to moment. But he said her name once more as she reached the door. And something in the way he said it, just her name, nothing else, no instruction or accusation attached, just Serena, in a voice that was stripped of all the operational armor, made her stop with her hand on the frame. She didn't turn around. I don't know when this happened, he said, quietly, not performing it. I don't know when you became someone I don't recognize. She stood in the doorway for a moment. I became someone you don't recognize, she said, because you stopped looking. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time without turning on the light. Her whole body was shaking slightly now, the aftermath of adrenaline, the physical toll of having held herself that steady for that long in a room with that much pressure in it. She pressed her palms to her thighs and breathed and let the shaking happen. She thought about the phone records, about the tech team, about the fact that somewhere in the operational infrastructure of this household, there was a person whose job it included monitoring her movements, her device activity, the pattern of her days. She had known, theoretically. She had always known, theoretically. Knowing and being told are different things. She sat in the dark and thought about the Callaway Gallery submission deadline. 6 weeks. The large canvas on the third floor, the figure mid-turn, the light finding her profile. The 2 smaller works. 3 pieces. A submission required a minimum of 3. She thought about what Luca had just done, and she thought about 12 years, and she thought about the woman in the red room at Costa Verne's show. The exhausted dignity, the presence without performance. And she made a decision that she knew, even as she was making it, was the kind that doesn't get unmade. She was going to submit to the exhibition. Under her name. Her own name. Serena Vale, not Serena Moretti. The name she had carried for 26 years before she had traded it. She was going to submit, and she was not going to ask permission, and she was not going to tell Luca until it was done. She went to the 3rd floor. She turned on the work lamp. She stood in front of the large canvas with her arms crossed and looked at the figure in the painting. The woman who was turning, who had been turning for weeks, who was almost all the way around now, the face almost visible. She picked up a brush. She worked until 2 in the morning. When she finally set the brush down and stepped back, the figure in the painting had turned completely. The face was visible. It was not a portrait. It was not realistic. It was painted the way truth sometimes gets painted, not as it appears but as it feels. The features slightly dissolved at the edges, the eyes dark and open and direct, looking out of the canvas with an expression that was not anger and not sorrow, but something that sat between and above both. Looking, simply, finally, looking. She photographed it on her phone. She sent it to Adrian with no caption. His response came 4 minutes later, even at that hour. Submit this. Whatever you're afraid of, submit this. She put this phone down. She looked at the painting. She thought about Luca pulling her phone records. She thought about 12 years of managed silence. She thought about Paolo bringing tea without being asked, and Diana saying, "Come as yourself," and Adrian's camera finding something in her face that she had forgotten was there. She thought about what happened to women in this world who stopped being useful to the men they were attached to. She had seen it. She was not naive about what the Moretti name provided and what it cost. She thought about all of it, and then she opened her laptop, navigated to the Callaway Gallery submission portal, and began filling out the application. Name, Serena Vale. She was halfway through the submission form when her phone rang. Not a message, a call. At 2:15 in the morning, Diana Voss. She picked up. "Diana, listen to me." Diana's voice was stripped of its usual irony, and the absence of it was so startling that Serena's hand tightened on the phone before Diana's next words arrived. "Something happened tonight, after you left the gallery last week. Serena, someone talked. About you and Adrian, about the studio visit. I don't know who, I don't know how it got back, but it's in the conversation now, Luca's conversation." Serena sat very still. What conversation? His inner circle, Castellano's people, the Varro family's liaison. Diana stopped. "Serena, in this world, a wife who has a private friendship with a man outside the family isn't a personal matter. It becomes a liability question, a trust question. These men start asking what she might have said, what she might know, what she could be used for." The cold was back, deeper this time. "Are you telling me I'm in danger?" Diana was quiet for exactly 1 second too long. "I'm telling you," she said carefully, "that the conversation has started, and once it starts, it doesn't stop on its own." Another pause. "Luca controls his people, for now. But there are people adjacent to Luca who don't answer to him the way they used to. Castellano's deal brought new interests into the circle. People Luca didn't fully vet because he needed the waterfront contracts." Serena looked at the submission form on her laptop screen. Her name in the field. Serena Vale. "What are you telling me to do?" she said. I'm telling you to understand what game you're in. Diana's voice was low and very clear. You've been playing a personal game, a private game about reclaiming yourself. That's real, and it matters, and I am on your side completely. But these people are playing a different game, and you just became a piece on their board without being asked. The laptop screen. The submission form. The large canvas against the wall with the figure finally turned, finally looking. I'm not going to stop, Serena said. Her voice surprised her. How flat it was. How certain. I know, Diana said. I just need you to know the cost. After she hung up, Serena sat in the work lamp's small circle of light and looked at her hands, paint still in the creases of her knuckles, a streak of gray-blue along the side of her right palm. She looked at the painting. She looked at her laptop. She finished filling out the submission form. She attached the 3 photographs of the work. She moved the cursor to the submit button, and before she pressed it, she understood with complete clarity that what happened next was not going to be a private matter between a husband and a wife. That the world she was pushing against was not simply a marriage with problems. That she was about to make a visible move inside an invisible game that had stakes she could not fully calculate. She pressed submit. The confirmation email arrived in her inbox 30 seconds later. She closed the laptop. She turned off the work lamp. In the dark, with the city lights coming faintly through the shuttered windows, the painting of the woman who had finally turned was just a shape against the wall. But Serena could feel it, looking back at her. And downstairs, at that same moment, Luca's phone was receiving a message from a number he recognized as belonging to a man named Reeves, his head of intelligence, a function that officially didn't exist. And the message contained 3 words and an attachment. The 3 words were, "You should see this." The attachment was a photograph. Serena, standing in the doorway of Adrian Cole's studio, her face turned toward the light, something in her expression that anyone who looked at it would recognize immediately as a woman in the first stages of becoming someone her husband no longer had a complete hold on. And Luca sat alone in the library where the argument had happened 2 hours ago, and he looked at the photograph for a long time. And what moved across his face in the dark and the quiet of that room was not the anger she had seen before. It was something that looked, for the first time, like fear. I was still in the library when she came downstairs at 7 the next morning. She didn't know that immediately. She came down in the way she had been coming down for weeks, quietly. The early hour hers, the household not yet running at operational speed, the particular stillness of a large house before its machinery engaged. She was wearing old clothes. She had paint under her fingernails from the night before that she hadn't fully cleaned. She was thinking about coffee and the 3rd floor and the submission confirmation sitting in her inbox and the specific lightness of a person who has done the irreversible thing and is still standing. She pushed open the kitchen door and walked through to the morning room and stopped. Luca was sitting at the long table with a coffee cup in front of him that had gone cold. He was still wearing the same clothes from the night before. The charcoal trousers, the white shirt, the loosened tie now removed entirely and lying on the table beside the cup like something discarded. He had not slept. She could see it in the quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of exhaustion rather than the stillness of control. The difference between a man at rest and a man who has spent the night motionless because moving felt like it would cost too much. He looked up when she came in. They looked at each other across the morning room for a long moment. "Sit down," he said. Not a command. The register was different, lower. She sat down across from him, not beside him, across. The table between them felt accurate. He looked at his cold coffee cup. He turned it slightly on the saucer with 2 fingers, a small mechanical gesture, and then stopped. "Reeves sent me a photograph last night." She waited. "You at Cole's studio, coming out." He looked up. "You looked the way you looked in that photograph." He stopped, something working in his jaw. "I've been sitting here trying to figure out if I'm angry because of what it might mean or because of what it definitely means." "What does it definitely mean?" she said carefully. "That you're happier walking out of that building than you've been walking into this one in years." He said it without self-pity, which made it worse. Just a man reading a photograph and telling her what he saw. That's what it definitely means. The morning room was very quiet. Outside, one of the groundsmen was somewhere on the property. She could hear the distant sound of equipment, a hedge trimmer or a leaf blower, the ordinary sounds of the estate maintaining itself. "Luca, I want to show you something." He reached across the table and turned his phone to face her. On the screen was a message chain. She recognized the format, an internal communication system his organization used, encrypted, the kind of messaging that left no trace in standard device logs. She read the top message, and the cold arrived again, fast and comprehensive, spreading from the center of her chest outward. The message was from a name she didn't recognize, a handle, not a real name, and it read, "The wife is a loose thread. Cole has international contacts. Suggest we determine what she knows and what she said before the Vero integration completes." Standard method, standard method. She knew what that meant. She had lived in this world long enough to know what standard method meant when applied to a loose thread. "Who sent this?" she said. Her voice came out flat. "Good. Someone in Castellano's network. Someone who moved laterally into my circle through the waterfront contracts." Luca took the phone back and looked at the message himself, and his face was doing something she had not seen before. Not anger at her, but something directed inward. Something that looked like a man examining a decision he had made and finding it more costly than advertised. "I shut it down. Last night, at 2 in the morning, I made 3 phone calls and I shut it down." She stared at him. "You made 3 phone calls?" "Yes." "To do what?" "To make clear that my wife is not a variable in anyone's operational calculus. That anyone who treats her as one will find that they have made a very significant miscalculation." He said it without theater. "Informational. It's handled. It's handled." She could feel something rising in her chest. Not gratitude, not relief, but something with more heat in it, something that was almost fury, rising up through the cold. "You had my phone records pulled, Luca, yesterday afternoon. You had Reeves surveilling my movements. You have been... This whole household has been structured as a monitoring apparatus, and I have been living inside it for 12 years, and now you're telling me that you also have people in your circle who are discussing what they might do to me. Because I went to a photographer's studio, and your solution is 3 phone calls in the middle of the night." "Yes." He met her eyes directly. "That's my solution. Because the alternative was worse, and I wasn't willing to let it get there." "You weren't willing." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it, hated the crack, hated that her body was doing this now, when she needed the steadiness. "Luca, do you hear yourself? You weren't willing. As though this is a business decision you made on my behalf. As though my safety is a resource you manage." He looked at her, and something in his face broke open slightly, just at the edges, a fracture in the control that she had watched him maintain against every pressure for 12 years. "I know," he said. She stopped. "I know," he said again, quieter. "I hear it. I know what it sounds like." The morning room held the words. "Then what?" she said. "What do you want me to do with that?" "I don't know." He pressed both hands flat on the table, and she looked at them. Large hands, heavy at the knuckles. And she thought of the first painting, the dark painting of hands pressing down, the one she had made without planning it, the one she had never shown anyone. And her throat tightened. "I have been sitting here all night, and I don't know, Serena. I don't know how to... I don't have language for this. I know how to solve problems. I know how to neutralize threats. I know how to walk into a room and make it go the direction I need it to go." He stopped. The jaw worked. "I don't know how to tell my wife that I spent 12 years not looking at her, and I'm looking now, and I don't know if it's too late." The silence was enormous. She sat with it. She did not rush to fill it. She had spent 12 years rushing to fill silences in this house, smoothing over the gaps, managing the space between them with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned that discomfort, if left alone, became something harder to control. She was done filling it. "It might be too late," she said finally. "Not cruel. True." He absorbed it. He nodded once, slightly, the way he nodded when he received information that confirmed what he had already calculated. "The exhibition," he said. She went still. "I know about the submission. Reeves." He stopped himself, breathed. "I know you submitted work to the Callaway Gallery. Under your name. Your maiden name." He looked at her. "I want you to know that I know, and I'm not going to interfere with it." She studied his face. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because 12 hours ago my first instinct was to make a call that would have resulted in the submission being quietly withdrawn without your knowledge." He held her gaze. "I didn't make that call. I want you to know I didn't make it." She felt the blood in her face, the flush of anger. "That was your first instinct, to pull my submission." Yes. And you want credit for not doing it? No. Still direct, still stripped of performance. I want you to understand that I know what I am. I know the instincts I'm working with. I'm not asking for credit. I'm asking you to understand that I'm trying to do something different with those instincts, and it doesn't come naturally. And I don't know if I'll get it right, but He stopped. He looked for a moment like a man standing at the edge of something very high, looking down, assessing the drop. I'm trying. She looked at him across the table in the morning light. This man she had married at 29, this man whose world she had moved into and slowly disappeared inside, this man who had spent a night in a chair looking at a photograph of her face and reading in it something that 12 years of living beside her had not shown him clearly. And she felt the full complexity of it, the weight of it, the fact that she was not simple enough to feel only one thing about him, had never been, would never be. The Varo integration, she said. What is it? A beat. A consolidation, new territory, new partnership. It's been in development for 8 months. Is it done? 3 weeks from completion. And when it completes, will Castellanos people still have access to this circle? He looked at her, reading the question. Some of them. People who see me as a loose thread. I told you. You made 3 phone calls. She leaned forward slightly. Luca, I need you to understand something. I am not asking you to protect me from your world. I am telling you that your world has become a threat to the thing I am trying to build, and I am not going to let that happen. Not again. Not ever again. Her voice was level, and there was something in it that he heard. She could see him hear it, the slight adjustment in his posture, the recognition. I submitted 3 paintings. The exhibition is in 6 weeks. I will be at that opening. I will be there as Serena Vale, not as your wife, not as a Moretti asset, not as anyone's loose thread. I will be there, and my work will be on those walls. And if anyone in your circle has a problem with that, that is your problem to solve. Are we clear? He looked at her for a long time. Yes, he said. Good. She stood up. She went to the kitchen and made fresh coffee and brought 2 cups back to the table and set one in front of him and sat down again. And they sat in the morning light and drank coffee and didn't talk. And it was the most honest silence they had shared in years. 3 days later, the Callaway Gallery called. She was in the 3rd floor room, working on a 4th piece, smaller, more controlled, a study in blues. When her phone rang with an unfamiliar number and a woman's voice introduced herself as Margot Chen, the Callaway's senior curator. We've reviewed your submission, Margot Chen said. I'd like to talk to you about your work. Serena set down her brush. All right, I want to be direct with you, Ms. Vale. We receive hundreds of submissions for this exhibition. What you've sent us is not what I expected. A pause. The large piece in particular, the figure, the light, it's doing something I haven't seen in a submission this cycle. There's an interior life in it that you can't manufacture. It either comes from somewhere real or it doesn't. Another pause. I'd like to include all 3 pieces, and I'd like to discuss whether you'd be willing to let us use the large piece as the exhibition's primary promotional image. Serena stood in the north light of her studio with paint on her hands and her heart doing something large and unsteady in her chest. Yes, she said. I'm willing. When she hung up, she stood very still for a moment. Then she sat down on the floor, just sat down, right there on the drop cloth, her back against the wall, and put her face in her hands and breathed. Not crying, just breathing, containing something. She called Diana. The Callaway, Diana said when Serena told her. Serena, that's not a small thing. I know. Does Luca know? Not yet. A beat. When are you going to tell him? She thought about the morning room, the cold coffee, the fracture at the edges of his control, the 3 phone calls in the night, the submission he hadn't pulled. Tonight, she said. She told him over dinner. Just the 2 of them, which had become slightly more common in recent days. Luca clearing his evenings earlier, a pattern she had noticed without commenting on. She told him the Callaway had called. She told him they were including all 3 pieces. She told him the large painting would be the promotional image. He put down his fork. He looked at her across the table. Tell me about the painting, he said. She looked back at him. A woman in a large room, very small. Back turned for most of it. She paused. She's turning around. Something moved through his face that she couldn't entirely name. Something that was not the operational man, not the controlled man, not the man who managed rooms and people and outcomes. Something that was underneath all of that, something older. I want to see it, he said. She considered it. Not yet. He nodded, accepted it. The exhibition opening was 5 weeks out when the situation with Castellanos' people stopped being handled. She found out on a Tuesday afternoon when Luca came home at 3 o'clock with his head of security, a man named Grafton, wide and quiet, who had been with Luca since before Serena came into the picture. And the two of them went directly to the study, and the door closed and didn't open for 2 hours. When Luca came out, he found her in the library, and his face was back to the controlled version, the armor fully engaged, and she knew something had happened. Tell me, she said. It's operational. Tell me anyway. He looked at her. The new habit of actually looking, of pausing before the deflection. Someone in Castellanos' network made a move this afternoon, against a different target, nothing to do with you. But it indicates that the containment I put in place last week has been circumvented. They're operating outside the structure I set. What does that mean for me? It means the 3 phone calls aren't sufficient. He said it with the specific tonelessness of a man making himself accountable for a miscalculation. I underestimated the extent to which Castellanos' people have integrated laterally. I should not have underestimated that. Luca. She kept her voice level. Are we talking about a real threat? I'm talking about a situation I'm going to resolve. He moved toward the door. I need to make calls. That's not an answer. He stopped. He turned. Yes. There is a real threat. It's not imminent. I'm going to remove it before it becomes imminent. That is what I'm going to do tonight. She stood up. And the exhibition. Something crossed his face. What about it? In 5 weeks, I'm standing in the Callaway Gallery in front of 3 paintings and my name on the wall. My name. Not yours. She held his gaze. Is that going to be a problem for the people who see me as a loose thread? The question sat in the air between them. Luca looked at her, at the set of her jaw, at the steadiness in her eyes, at whatever it was in her face that Adrian's camera had found, and that Luca was only now learning to see. And she watched him make a calculation that was different from his usual calculations, one that weighed something other than strategy and outcome. No, he said, it's not going to be a problem. How? Because I'm going to make sure it isn't. He held her gaze. Trust me. The words landed differently than they used to. Trust me. She had heard that from him 100 times, 1,000, the shorthand of a powerful man asking for deference he generally received without question. She had given it for years in the absence of alternatives. Now she looked at him and she measured the words against everything, against the phone records, against the photograph, against the cold coffee, and the night in the chair, and the submission he hadn't pulled and the look on his face when she told him the painting was about a woman turning around. She was still measuring when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face went absolutely still. I have to take this, he said. I know. He answered it as he moved into the hallway, his voice dropping to the operational register, the language of men managing dangerous things. And she stood in the library alone and listened to the sound of his voice receding down the corridor, and she put both hands flat on the surface of her own chest and felt her heart moving under them. 5 weeks. 5 weeks until those paintings were on a wall with her name beside them, visible, public, permanently beyond taking back. 5 weeks until she stood in front of a room full of strangers and let the work speak for what 12 years of silence and 6 weeks of reclamation had produced. 5 weeks, and somewhere in the infrastructure of her husband's world, men who dealt in standard methods were recalculating what she cost them. She pressed her hands harder against her chest. She breathed. She was still standing there when the sound of Luca's voice in the hallway shifted. A change in register she felt rather than heard. The difference between a man managing a situation and a man absorbing a blow. And then the silence that followed was the wrong kind of silence, the kind that meant something had just changed shape. And then Luca appeared in the doorway. His face was... She had known this man for 14 years, had studied his face across 1,000 dinners and 100 confrontations and a dozen genuine crises, and she had never seen it look like this. What? She said. He looked at her and the armor was entirely gone, and what was underneath it was a man standing at the edge of something he had not anticipated and did not know how to manage and could not, for the first time in his life, simply overpower. The Varo integration, he said. It's not a consolidation. She waited. It's a takeover. His voice was very quiet. They've been positioning for 18 months. Castellano wasn't resistance. He was the opening. I walked them into my own circle and I didn't. He stopped. The jaw. The stillness. Serena, I need you to listen to me very carefully. She was already listening. She had never stopped. The word that Luca used was exposure. He said it standing in the library doorway, with his face stripped of everything she had spent 12 years watching him maintain, and he said the Varo family had been building a case, not a legal case, not the kind that ended in courtrooms, but the kind that ended in leverage, in control, in the transfer of power from one set of hands to another through the accumulation of documented vulnerabilities. 18 months of positioning. Every contract, every handshake, every lateral introduction through Castellano's network had been a thread in a web that Luca had walked into believing he was expanding his empire and had instead been walking deeper into someone else's. They knew about the waterfront contracts and what they had required to close. They knew about 3 men who had stopped being problems in ways that created other kinds of problems, if documented correctly. They knew about money that moved through structures that existed specifically because they could not be examined directly. And now they knew about Serena. Not as a loose thread, as a pressure point. They're not going to move against you physically, Luca said. He had come fully into the room now, was standing in the center of it, not pacing. Luca did not pace, but with an energy under his stillness that she could feel from across the room, like heat from a surface that hadn't cooled yet. That's not their method. Varo's method is suffocation. They find what you can't afford to lose, and they put their hands around it. And what can't you afford to lose? She said. He looked at her. She understood before he said it. The exhibition, she said. If Varo's people start making calls to the Callaway, making suggestions about who Serena Vale actually is and who she's married to, if they start attaching your name to the operational history of this family in ways that reach the gallery, the press, the broader art community, he stopped. It poisons everything. Everything you've built. Not because it's true, because it's adjacent to things that are, and in this world adjacent is close enough. She stood very still. She thought about the submission confirmation in her inbox. Margot Chen's voice on the phone. The large piece is doing something I haven't seen this cycle. The promotional image. Her name. Her maiden name, chosen specifically because it was hers and not his, and now it was the target. Not despite being separate from his world. Because it was separate. Because it was visible. Because it was the thing she had built without him, and the thing she could not protect with the same machinery that protected everything else in this life. How long do I have? She said. He looked at her with something in his eyes she didn't immediately name. Before they move? Before I need to decide. The silence stretched. Serena, how long? A week. Maybe 10 days. He pressed 2 fingers to his mouth briefly, a gesture she recognized as the one he made when he was working through something he hadn't finished calculating. I'm going to deal with Varo. I want you to understand that this is not a problem I'm going to manage around. I'm going to remove it, but it takes time and it takes... He stopped again. It takes the kind of moves that I can't explain to you and that you shouldn't have to know about. She looked at him across the library. This room that had been the site of their worst conversation and their most honest morning, and now this. And she felt the full weight of the life she was inside. Not its luxury, not its power, not the abstract knowledge of what her husband was and what he did. The actual weight of it. The specific gravity of being the wife of a man whose world generated threats the way weather generated rain. Not as aberration, but as condition. She had lived inside that weight for 12 years without ever standing directly under it. She was standing under it now. I'm not withdrawing the submission, she said. I know. I need to hear that you understand that. Not that you accept it strategically, that you understand it. He looked at her for a long time, and something moved in his face. The fracture she had seen at the edges that morning in the kitchen, widening slightly, a man letting himself be read. I understand that if I ask you to withdraw it, I'm doing the same thing Varo is doing. I'm using the exhibition as a pressure point, just from a different direction. He paused. I'm not going to do that. She breathed. Then handle it, she said. Whatever you have to do, handle it. He nodded once. He left the room and she heard him on the phone before he reached the end of the hallway. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and she did not allow herself to think about what handle it meant in the operational language of Luca Moretti, because she had made a decision long ago about which doors she did not open, which knowledges she did not acquire, and that decision had kept her functional inside this life, and she was not going to unmake it now. She thought instead about the painting, the woman who had turned, the face finally visible, the light finding her. She thought about whether she was brave or just past the point of being able to afford cowardice. She decided it didn't matter. The result was the same. The next 7 days were the strangest of her marriage. Luca was present in a way he had not been present in years. Not hovering, not surveilling, but genuinely there. At breakfast. At dinner. Moving through the house with a quality of attention she had forgotten he was capable of. The focused awareness of a man who had recalibrated what required his attention and found the answer closer to home than he had been looking. He asked her about the paintings, not with the obligatory interest of a man performing attentiveness, with actual questions, specific ones, the kind that indicated he had been thinking about what she'd told him. He asked what the figure in the large painting was looking at once she had turned. He asked if the blues in the smaller study were deliberate or instinctive. He asked what it felt like, after 12 years, to stand in front of a blank canvas again. She answered him. Carefully at first, then less carefully. The answers were not simple, and she did not make them simple, and he sat with the complexity without trying to resolve it into something more manageable, which was new. On the 4th day, she took him to the 3rd floor. She had not planned it. She had gone up in the late afternoon to do some work on the 4th canvas, and she had heard him on the stairs. Not Paolo's light step, not the deliberate quietness of the household staff, but the particular weight of Luca's footsteps, which she had memorized over 14 years. And she had stood in the doorway of the studio and watched him come up the last flight and stop when he saw her. I wasn't, he started. Come in, she said. He came into the room slowly, the way people enter spaces they understand are not theirs. He looked at the supply cabinet, the drop cloth, the work lamp, the small utility sink. He looked at the 4th canvas on the easel, and then he turned and looked at the large canvas, which she had moved off the wall and propped upright against the supply cabinet, the figure fully visible, the face finally turned. He stood in front of it for a long time. She watched him look at it, and she felt the vulnerability of it, the specific exposure of having made something honest, and then standing in the room while someone who had been part of its subject matter looked at it. There was nothing she could do to manage his response. The painting said what it said. It had always said what it said. That was the whole point. That's you, he said finally. Not a question. It's not a portrait. No. He was quiet. But it's you. He looked at the face in the painting, the slightly dissolved features, the dark open eyes, the expression that lived between anger and sorrow and above both of them. You've been looking like this for a long time. Yes. He stood with that. And I didn't see it, he said. No. Another silence. He reached out slightly toward the canvas and then stopped his hand before it made contact, an instinct to touch checked by a different instinct. The recognition that some things you don't get to put your hands on just because you want to. He let the hand drop. It's the best thing I've ever seen, he said, and I mean that in a way that has nothing to do with you being my wife. She looked at the side of his face, at the hard jaw and the lines around his mouth, and the particular quality of his profile when he was genuinely moved by something and trying to carry it without performance. I know, she said. On the 7th day, Luca came home at 6 in the evening, and he walked into the kitchen where she was making tea, and he said, It's done. She turned. Varro, he said, it's done. She searched his face. How? The documentation they were building, the leverage they were accumulating, it won't reach anyone. And the specific people who were tasked with managing it as it related to you have been redirected. He held her gaze. That's as much as I can tell you. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about asking more. She decided against it, the same decision she had been making for 12 years, the door she kept closed. But she felt the difference between closing it from fear and closing it from choice, and this time it was choice, and that difference mattered. The exhibition opens in 4 weeks, she said. I know. I want you to come. Something shifted in his face. You want me there. I want you there as my husband. She held his gaze. Not as protection, not as management, as the man who stood in front of a painting on the third floor and said it was the best thing he'd ever seen. She paused. Can you be that man for one evening? He looked at her, and the answer in his eyes arrived before the words did. Yes. The 4 weeks moved differently than any 4 weeks she could remember inside this life. She painted every morning. The fourth canvas resolved itself in the second week. Not the room, not the figure, but something new, something she hadn't planned. Two people in a space, not touching, not looking at each other, but present in the same frame with a quality of awareness between them that was not romance and not hostility, but something more durable than either. She didn't show it to Luca. She submitted it to the Callaway as a fourth piece, a late edition, and Margot Chen called her within an hour and said yes without hesitation. She called Adrian the week before the opening. I wanted to tell you before you saw it somewhere else, she said. The Callaway is using the large piece as the primary promotional image. It's been in their social media, their print materials. Your portrait series. If people connect the subjects, I don't want you to be blindsided. I've seen it, he said. Margot sent me a preview. She's an old contact. A pause. Serena, the painting is extraordinary. I know, she said, and the absence of false modesty in it would have been impossible 6 months ago. How are things at home? She looked out the window of the third-floor studio, at the grounds below, at the security man doing his sweep. The same grounds, the same sweep, the architecture of the life unchanged in its externals, and shifted in its internals in ways that might or might not hold. Complicated, she said. Real, both at once. That's the only kind of good worth having, Adrian said. She smiled at the window. Take care of yourself, Adrian. You too. She did not message him after that. Not because she had been told not to, not because it had been negotiated or managed or extracted from her as a condition of peace. Because she was done with the chapter of her life in which Adrian Cole had been necessary, and she knew it, and she could close it without being asked to. The night of the exhibition opening, she stood in front of the mirror in her dressing room for the second time in this story. But it was not the same mirror, and it was not the same woman. She was wearing deep green, not structured and cinched, not designed to perform anything. A dress that moved when she moved and asked nothing from her except that she show up in it honestly. Her hair was down. The diamond earrings from her 10th anniversary were in their box on the dresser. She picked up a different pair. Small, plain, silver. Something she had bought herself. Luca appeared in the doorway of the dressing room. He was in a dark suit. She had seen him choose it, had watched him reject 2 others, which was not a thing he had ever done in her presence before. The visible effort of a man who wanted to get something right. Ready? He said. She looked at his reflection in the mirror, then at her own. Yes, she said. The Callaway Gallery was full in the way the ballroom of the Moretti estate had been full on the night this story began. But the charge in the air was entirely different. This room was full of people who were looking at things, really looking, with the focused quiet of people encountering work that was asking something of them. She stood in the entrance for a moment with Luca beside her, and she felt the room, felt its attention distributed across the walls, the light, the work. And she felt herself inside it not as an ornament, not as a symbol, not as the architecture of someone else's image, as a source. The large painting was hung on the gallery's main wall, lit from above. The promotional reproduction nothing compared to the actual thing. The figure large enough now to fill a viewer's peripheral vision. The turned face present and direct and offering nothing soft. A small cluster of people stood in front of it in silence, which was the best thing a painting could produce in a viewer. Margot Chen found her near the entrance, and the 2 women shook hands, and Chen said, with the directness of someone who had spent 30 years in rooms like this, the response to this piece has been unlike anything we've had this cycle. 3 collectors have already inquired. I wanted you to hear that from me directly, before the evening gets complicated. Serena looked at the large painting across the room. Thank you, she said, for taking the risk. It wasn't a risk, Margot said simply. That's what genuine work looks like. You can't fake it. Luca stayed close but not attached. She could feel him calibrating, the effort of being present without controlling, of occupying space in her world without organizing it around himself. He was not good at it. She could see him catch himself twice, the instinct to steer suppressed by the decision not to. The effort was visible, and she respected it more than she would have respected easy competence. Late in the evening, after the crowd had thinned and the caterers were beginning their quiet reset of the drinks table, he found her standing alone in front of the 4th painting, The two figures in the shared space, aware of each other, not yet touching. He stood beside her. They looked at it together. "Is that us?" he said. "It might be," she said. "Or it might be two people who could be us, if they do the work." He was quiet for a moment. "What's the work?" She turned to look at him, at the hard jaw and the dark eyes and the lines that came from decades of decisions most people didn't want to know about, and the new thing underneath all of that, the fracture that had been widening for months, the place where the armor had given way and something without armor was learning to stand in the open. "You're already doing some of it," she said, "badly. But yes." Something that was almost a smile moved across his face. Not the performance smile she had seen him use 1,000 times in 1,000 rooms. Something involuntary. Something that started lower and felt closer to real. "I want to do it right," he said. "I know." She held his gaze. "I need you to know something, Luca. I'm going to tell you this once, and I need you to keep it." She waited until she was sure he was fully present, fully receiving. "If you ever make me feel invisible again, if you ever reduce me back to something that exists for the composition of your life, if I ever stand in a room and feel myself disappear the way I disappeared for 12 years, she held his gaze and did not soften it. "I will leave. And this time I will know exactly who I am when I do, and I will not come back." He looked at her and did not flinch. "I know," he said. "I need more than I know." "I won't," he said. "I will not make you invisible again." He said it without theater, without the cadence of a promise constructed for effect. He said it the way he said things when he meant them operationally, flatly, with his full weight behind it. "I see you, Serena. I see you clearly. I should have been looking years ago, and I wasn't, and I can't fix that. But I'm looking now." She held the words, measured them. Not against what she wanted to be true, but against what she knew of this man, his capacity, his limitations, the specific dimensions of what he was capable of changing and what was structural in him and would require years of pressure to shift. She measured it honestly. It was not enough to erase 12 years. It was enough to begin. She looked back at the fourth painting. The two figures in the shared space, neither touching, neither performing, simply present and aware. "Come to therapy with me," she said. "Once a week. I've been seeing someone for the past month." She had not told him this. "I want you to come." He was quiet for a moment. A man for whom the concept of sitting in a room and being examined was as foreign as any landscape he had never visited. "All right," he said. She turned to look at him. "All right," he said again. Steadier. She nodded once. Then she turned back to the painting. They stood in front of it for a while longer, the gallery settling into its end of evening quiet around them, the work on the walls continuing to do what it had been made to do, tell the truth about what it cost a person to disappear and what it cost them to come back. 3 months later, Luca drove her to a small coastal town 2 hours from the city. No security detail. She had asked for that, and after one day of resistance he had agreed, and they had driven with the windows down in the early morning, and she had watched the coastline open up as they left the city's gravity and felt the specific lightness of being outside the architecture of their daily life. They stayed in a small rented house above the harbor. They cooked bad pasta on the second night and laughed about it in a way that required nothing from either of them except the ability to find something genuinely funny, which turned out to be something they still had access to, underneath everything. They walked on the beach in the mornings before it was fully light, their footsteps loud on the wet sand, not always talking, sometimes just moving through the same space with the new quality of awareness they were building. Not comfort exactly, not yet, but something that might become comfort if they kept at it, kept showing up for the work of it, kept choosing the honest thing over the manageable one. On the third morning, she stopped walking and turned to look at the water. He stopped beside her. The light was coming up behind them, thin and gray and particular, and the water was moving the way water moves when there's nothing urgent in it. A continuous, unhurried action, each wave carrying the same patient intention as the one before. "I submitted 4 more pieces to a gallery in the city," she said, "for a solo show, early spring." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Margot Chen called the house," he said. "She wanted to discuss framing for the promotional materials. Paolo took the message." He paused. "I told him to pass it directly to you. I didn't read it." She looked at him for a long time. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged slightly, the way people shrug when they have done the right thing and don't want credit for it, which was new for him, and which cost him something, and which she saw. She turned back to the water. They stood there on the wet sand in the early light, two imperfect people with a damaged and ongoing history between them, and she felt the full weight of the past year, the ballroom and the terrace, and the north light, and the blank canvas, and the hands in the first painting, and the figure turning, and the phone records, and the standard method, and the exhibition opening, and the two figures in the shared space. She felt all of it, the cost of it, the toll it had taken, and she did not try to make it smaller or tidier or more resolved than it actually was. It was not resolved. It was ongoing. It was the work. She was not the woman who had stood at the edge of that ballroom 12 months ago, invisible in a midnight blue dress, counting the minutes since her husband had looked at her. She was not that woman, and she would not go back to being her. She was also not simple, not clean, not arrived at a destination. She was 41 years old, and she was a painter, and she was a wife, and she was a woman who had disappeared and come back and was still in the process of coming back, still finding the edges of herself that had been buried and held under for too long, still learning which parts of her were her own and which parts had been shaped by the pressure of someone else's world. She was in the middle of that work. That was not a failure. That was the whole point. Behind her, the light was coming up. She could feel it on her back, warming her through the jacket, the particular physical sensation of light finding a person and illuminating them from behind. Not softly, not flatteringly, but honestly, the way early morning light is honest, the way it shows surfaces as they are without any of the evening's strategic shadows. She thought about the painting on the Callaway's main wall, the woman who had turned, the face visible, finally, the light finding her profile, the expression that lived between anger and sorrow and above both of them. She understood now what the figure in that painting had been looking at, not at anything outside the frame, just forward, just at the fact of being present and visible and refusing to be erased, just at the ongoing, difficult, specific work of being alive and accounted for. Beside her, Luca's hand moved and found hers, not reaching, not claiming, just arriving, the way hands arrive when they have decided to try the honest thing, tentative and warm, and carrying the full weight of everything that had happened and the question of whether it was enough to begin. She let her fingers close around it, not as an answer, as a choice. The water moved in front of them, patient and continuous, and the light came up behind them, and neither of them spoke, because some things are more completely said in the silence that follows the hardest conversations, in the breathing, in the standing, in the simple fact of two people who have cost each other a great deal and have decided, imperfectly and without guarantees, to see what remains. What remained was this: the morning, the light, the water. Her hand in his, and the paintings on walls with her name beside them, and the studio on the third floor waiting, and the work still ahead of her. The work that belonged entirely to her, that no power structure and no threat and no 12 years of careful erasure had managed to extinguish permanently. They had tried. She was still here. She was finally, completely, and without apology, still here.